This is a University of Otago podcast.
My name is Colin Campbell Hunt. I'm here representing Jeanette Stevenson, the director of CSAFE, for whom Jeanette Fitzsimmons, who is close to my right here, is on their advisory board. Is that the word for it? Yes, that's right. And Jeanette is here today along with Rosemary Penwidden, to whom I'm not quite so close, representing Coal Action Network New Zealand. What's the acronym? How does that come out?
CANA.
CANA. There you go. Quite close to Latin for dog. Of no relevance.
I hope the report's not a dog.
No, not at all. So Janet gives her apologies. She is double booked. She hates that she's not here, but she isn't. Can't be. Can I just say that this is an amazing week for these kind of events this week here at Otago. Last night we had a policy debate with the Greens and the Labour people. On Friday, there is a session in St David's Seminar Room 1 at 2 o'clock, if I remember rightly, Bob. Where are you, Bob? 2 o'clock, with Gareth Hughes, who is the Greens Labour spokesman on climate change, and really good. So there's lots on, and there are other things as well, which I know that I don't know all of them. So just very briefly to introduce Jeanette Fitzsimmons, who I know is well known to all of you. Wonderful career and warrior for the cause as leader of the Greens Party for many years, and in this role here, as I've said, the Coal Action Network. Rosemary Penwidden, when she's not fighting coal, she's fighting oil. The Oil Free Otago group hasn't yet been out on the boat, but it's going to happen. And Jeanette has been out on the boat. May I clip you up again?
Indeed.
No, would you like to do that? It's probably a better idea.
Probably.
So welcome these people.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you for coming. Thank you, CSAFE and the Climate Change Network for hosting this, and I look forward to some discussion at the end. We're right on the brink of a huge transition for humanity as we move past the age of fossil fuels into the post-fossil era. And when you have huge transitions of this kind, and we've had a few, human and animal power, and then steam power driven by coal, and then oil, and then the whole electricity, electronics, internet age, and now we have to move past fossil fuels. And usually in those big transitions, somebody gets hurt. In this case, it's looking like being the small communities that have always relied on coal, and it's suddenly being taken away from them. So this report is looking at how we can prevent that from happening, how we can accomplish a just transition away from coal into a low-carbon future, which has got a lot of opportunities attached. Now, the report was written by about 5 of us, all holding the pen at different stages, and Rosemary is one of my co-conspirators, I suppose I should say co-collaborators, Rosemary Penwidden, and she lives in Dunedin, and so it's great to be able to share the platform with her while I'm down here, and she's going to tell you a little bit about CANA, and we're going to be sort of like the two Ronnies passing it backwards and forwards between us. And I think you better have this, Rosemary, or they're not going to be able to hear you.
I know. Will I have to stand as close to it as...
Well, you could.
I could. Yes. I'm just going to... Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I'm going to give one little wee bit and then pass back to Jeanette. So you just keep it, Jeanette.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Coal Action Network, in its current form, came together in around 2011, and it was in response mainly to Solid Energy's plans to increase our carbon dioxide emissions by up to 10 to 20% with the digging up of this Southland lignite. So, a bit closer? Okay, thanks. Lignite to briquettes, lignite to urea, lignite to liquid fuel. Now, they bought up almost all the Matara Valley. Anyway, we're very pleased that did not go ahead. we do have...
We do, of course, take full credit for that.
Indeed. So we're really made up of students, of academics, of grandmothers and great-grandmothers and activists, and we work collaboratively. For me personally, with a union background, what attracted me to Coal Action Network was not just the obvious fact that we've got to phase out coal, and the sooner the better, but because Coal Action Network, one of its main objectives is to work towards a society where people come before profit. And I'm going to pass on to Jeanette now.
Thanks, Rosemary. Well, the basic theme we're starting with is coal is already a sunset industry, and even the industry itself recognises that. That's a quote there from the print. Am I making that feedback? We can manage without it. Anyway, about a week ago, on Radio New Zealand on an Insight program about what is happening to the West Coast at the moment, which is very sad, interviewed the current CEO of Solid Energy and said, and how soon do you think coal prices are going to recover? And he said, you're making the assumption that they will recover. And I thought that was an extraordinary thing for the head of a large coal company to say. So the industry knows it is a sunset industry. And there are a number of contributing factors. Don Elder described it as a perfect storm. We'll look more at how market prices have collapsed in a minute and at the Solid Energy job layoffs. Renewables have come down massively in price and are now challenging coal as a fuel for electricity all over the world. China is producing less steel than it was. It's not growing quite as fast as it was. It's really concerned about the pollution from coal and steel, which is killing at least 1 million people a year in China from air pollution. And they have set a target in their 5-year plan for coal use to peak and start to decline in the next 5 years. If only India would do the same. They're recycling a lot more steel, which doesn't require the use of coal, so they're still producing steel, but they're managing to recycle a lot more, which can be done in electric arc furnaces without coal. The health effects are driving some of this move away from coal. Coal combustion contributes to heart disease, cancer, stroke, respiratory diseases, and it's particularly bad for children. And the communities that mine coal also tend to burn it in their homes, in open fires, which are the most inefficient and polluting way of doing it. And then, of course, there's climate change, the big sleeper. We've known about it for 40 years, done almost nothing about it, and it's catching up with us very fast. We will come back to some of those issues. That's what's happened to the price of coking coal since 2012. It's less than half what it was then. I couldn't find a graph that started in 2011, but if I had, you would have noticed that in 2011 it was $330 a tonne. So the price is now about a third of what it was at its peak. Now that was a fairly short-term peak, but that was the point where Bathurst was making its plans to mine the Denniston Plateau and Solid Energy was making its plans to do the lignite project. So this is what has driven the layoffs at the moment. It is not the environmental movement that has done it. This is coking coal, but thermal coal, although it's cheaper, has followed a similar price path. Nobody is expecting a recovery before the end of next year, and many people don't think it will happen then, and some people don't think it will happen at all. It's not just New Zealand. Mines are closing around the world. Others are starting, but Rio Tinto, BHP Billiton are all closing big coal mines. There are mines closing in the huge Galilee coal mining area in Australia, even while others are trying to open. We have the bizarre situation that you get through the market where Solid Energy is laying off people and closing mines, and Bathurst is trying to set up a new one or a new 6 on the top of the Denniston Plateau. But the fact is, the coal price is going to have to go up to something like $160 a tonne from just over 100 where it is now before Denniston is economic. And it's going to have to go to 140, 145 to even break even. But who would bother putting all that effort into an industry only to break even? Go the snails, quite right. These are the job losses. This is your bit, Rosemary. These are the job losses since 2012. Come and use. Do you want to use that?
Actually,
Here you go, use this. Because otherwise it won't go on the...
carbon bubble was coming first.
Oh, okay. All right, I'll do... Sorry, you see, this is what happens. This is cooperation for you.
You've no idea the hours we spent on the phone over this report.
Yeah, okay. All right, then just quickly, these are the layoffs starting in 2012. Huge numbers affecting the West Coast worse than anywhere else. And when we produced the report, we thought there were still... No, we'll come back to that number later. But what I'm saying is the layoffs have continued, and even since this report was published, there have been the 135 at Stockton, which have made it worse. So it's close to 1,000 have been laid off by Solid Energy. No provision for those people, no provision for those communities, no just transition, no sense of a tradition. Just, we don't want you now. If the price goes up, we'll want you again. You are just an input to production, like capital or resources. The big news is that the price of renewables has come down dramatically. The best illustration I can give you is that in 1993, we bought solar panels for the new house that we built in the Coromandel because we were too far off the grid for it to be economic to connect. And we paid $1993 for a 60-watt panel. Last year, we expanded the system and we paid the same amount for 500 watts that we had paid for 60 watts, and that was in dollars of much lesser value. I haven't bothered to work out the inflation effect. So solar energy is becoming cost-effective for electricity generation in many parts of the world, including under some circumstances in New Zealand. And last year, this is the thing that really blew me away when I found it, the US solar industry employed more people than coal and gas combined. Now, Rosemary's going to take over here and talk about the climate change drivers of the sunset industry.
Now, apparently this is working, but it might
give you
start
feedback.
making that...
We'll try and see what happens.
Hello? Yes. Now, I think, this might be easier. You can have a seat. So, this is completely preaching to the converted, but I'd like to go through it anyway. The bottom line is the year 2000. The top of the bubble, 2,795 gigatons. Coal, oil and gas, those three circles are what is on these industries' books. This is what runs their share price. These are their assets. You can, of course, see how scarily large coal is. Of course, we've got the 2-degree line. The difference between that line and the bottom is how much we can burn before we hit the 2 degrees. The smaller red line below the higher one is how much we've already burnt. And of course the bottom one is what we have remaining. So that's 565 gigatons. Maybe a little bit less now. The IPCC says that at the current rate, we keep going the way we are, all of our carbon budget will be used within 15 to 25 years. If we look at the best case scenario there, that puts my grandson Arlo at age 28, when we have to stop pumping any more carbon into the atmosphere. Now, I press... Just right, just left a bit. What does coal mean to New Zealand? Less than 10% of our primary energy. Mainly, the biggest user is BHP New Zealand Steel, although that fluctuates with the Huntly Power Station, which is very much up and down. Huntly is currently used to meet the residual demand after hydro. Sometimes it's higher than Glenbrook and sometimes lower. Huntly Power Station could close tomorrow. We don't need it. And Jeanette will talk about that later. About 18% of our coal is used by Fonterra in its milk drying plants. And that amount is growing. At the moment, about 60% of our coal is exported. Most of that is the West Coast high-quality coking or bituminous coal. That 60% was worth around $400 million in 2012. It is now half that amount. Now, my job was to find out how many coal miners we have in New Zealand. It was not easy. It was a very interesting exercise. In the end, I decided to ring all the coal mines, talk to real people, and just find out from them how many people were working there. And I'm really glad I did, even though it took quite a few days out of my summer holiday. Those numbers, by the way, have changed a wee bit with Solid Energy's most recent layoffs and some layoffs from Bathurst. Two things I learnt, which I thought were really useful. One of them is, Kai Tangata, down the road from here, has only one worker. That's the boss. The other 8 are just hangers-on. The other thing was, I spoke to lots of wives of miners and supervisors at the sites and also community liaison people. It sort of brought home to me, talking to all these people, that every one of these numbers is a person, is a livelihood, is a piece of a family and a piece of a community. Even so, I think it's really important to compare this number. We've got it down, Jeanette and I are debating, but we've got it down to about 1,080 or so people. Compare this number with the almost 40,000 jobs that have been lost in manufacturing between 2007 and 2012. And we do wonder when, a little while ago, it was last year, Stephen Joyce came out and said, "Hey, Forest and Bird, you should stop debating this Denniston mine because we need jobs, we need jobs." That sounded very disingenuous to us in Coal Action Network. I'm passing back to Jeanette now.
So last year, I noted that communities always think they want a coal mine because it brings prosperity and it brings jobs. And I thought, well, how much prosperity and how much jobs do coal mining communities actually have? So I went to the 2013 statistics, the census statistics. I pulled out all the communities that are closest to the operating coal mines we have at the moment, and they're down the left-hand column. And I looked at how they compared with the surrounding district or region for median incomes and percentage of workforce-aged people with full-time jobs. You can't use the unemployment figures because if you're working 1 hour a week, you're employed, according to stats. So I thought full-time jobs were a better indication of how employed the community was. And it turns out that almost without exception, and the exceptions are explainable, almost without exception, coal mining communities are significantly poorer and significantly more unemployed than the wider districts that they're part of. So there goes that myth. Coal does not bring prosperity and jobs to communities. It obviously creates wealth for somebody, but it's not the local community. And you can debate why. There's some reasons. A lot of the miners who earn very high incomes don't actually live in the local communities for a start. Anyway, phasing out coal gives us 4 challenges for what we're going to do instead. What are we going to do to replace the smallish but nevertheless real part that coal plays in our energy system? What are we going to do to replace its contribution to the New Zealand economy? What are we going to do for miners who will progressively need to find other work as coal mines run out of coal? And what are we going to do, and this is the hardest one, to create prosperity for the small communities, often isolated, which have come to rely for generations on coal for their economy? Replacing coal for energy is not that hard. The really easy bit is electricity. New Zealand has huge renewable electricity resources, particularly geothermal and wind, but domestic solar is becoming a small-scale option now. There are enough geothermal and wind power stations, not only designed, but actually with consents, could start building them tomorrow, to replace Huntly 3 to 5 times, depending on how you count the power output. 3 to 5 times Huntleys from power stations all ready to go. Why aren't they being built? Because we don't need them at the moment. Electricity demand is fairly flat, and Huntly's there. If Huntly closed, they would get built. That would be a lot of jobs. So while Rosemary said you could close Huntly tomorrow, I think you should probably give it a year's notice, or give the country a year's notice, and then life would go on perfectly fine. But there'd be a lot of jobs created in building those. And just by the way, all the steel in Huntly could then be recycled using electric arc furnaces rather than coal, and there's another plus. Gets a little bit harder when we come to boilers. A lot of coal is used in boilers for heat, and it's used because it's the cheapest fuel. It's used because it is dirt cheap, which is appropriate given that it's a very dirty fuel, that it should be dirt cheap. And losing very much. And the big opportunity there is wood waste. At least half of every tree that's cut for timber is waste, ends up as waste. A little bit of it is waste at the processing plant. Most of it is left in the forest. Damaged logs, logs that aren't up to scratch, branches, bark, etc. It's mostly just left to rot. It's often piled up on the skid sites. Some of it is actually burned to get rid of it because it's in the way. That could be collected, it could be chipped and dried and transported to boilers instead of coal. But as long as coal doesn't pay for its full environmental costs, that's going to be hard. So a decent price on carbon is the first step to getting that to happen. And then you need an organised industry, and that industry will not happen unless it knows that the price on carbon is going to be stable or rising. Nobody's going to build an industry based on a carbon price with the experience of what's happened with the ETS over recent years. It's just too risky. So you need some government action there. Steel is the hardest one of all. Worldwide, steel is the hardest place to replace coal. It will probably be the last to go. But even there are things that can be done. Worldwide, about 30% of steel is recycled. You could probably get that up to 80% if you tried, and if it were economic. In other words, if there was a high price on carbon. Then you can use charcoal made from wood. But the risk in advocating that is that people will do what Brazil is doing and make biochar from old growth forests, and that's the last thing we want to advocate. But some of that wood waste in the forest could be used to make biochar. And we have a new technology in New Zealand, a little firm called Carbonscape based in Blenheim, that has invented a whole new process using microwaves which are to very energy efficiently turn that wood chip into what they call green coke, which is a drop-in substitute for coke made from coal for blast furnaces. They've got orders for the stuff. It's been tested. It exceeds specifications. They've got orders. They can't fill them because they haven't got the capital to build the first plant of the scale they need. If you want to mine the Denniston Plateau, you just go along to Westpac and they give you $5 million loan like that. If you want to set up a green, sustainable industry, it's so much harder. Wood is, in fact, the big neglected opportunity in New Zealand, not just for energy. People are looking at processes to turn waste wood into liquid fuels as well as into coke for steel making and boiler fuel and domestic fuel. I mean, how many people here use wood pellets or chips in their burners at home? Yeah, right, that's great. Our household runs on wood, but then we're on a farm and there's just so much of it everywhere we even sell it. But later, I'll come back to wood being the big neglected opportunity when we talk about industrial opportunities, because we could be doing a heap more with our timber than we actually are. So, for the economy at large, what would a low carbon economy look like? I'm going to go on one. We're not the only people looking at a low carbon, clean energy economy. It's happening all over the world. There are think tanks everywhere working on it. ESCAP is an Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. The Global Green Growth Institute has 20 member countries working in it. The World Bank has a green growth knowledge platform. New Zealand's Pure Advantage is a group of industries who are advocating for taking climate change seriously and developing a low carbon economy. These are not small, greeny, sandal-wearing organisations. These are the big guys. And PricewaterhouseCoopers has estimated, I don't know how you actually do such estimates, but they've published it, that there's $22 billion a year is the potential New Zealand share of the global market for clean technologies if we choose to go after it. We won't get any of it unless we do choose to go after it. Now, how do I go backwards? No, yes, there we go. So, all these studies that are being done of low carbon economies, what do they look like? Well, they all start with energy efficiency. Sounds boring. We've been talking about it for years, at least I've been talking about it for 40 years. I'm so bored with energy efficiency. But you have to keep talking about it because, it's still only happening a little bit and there's still so much potential for it. Not just insulating houses, that's a real no-brainer. Every extra 100,000 homes that you put on the insulation program is 4,000 jobs. That's more, way more than coal mining employs straight off. But also energy efficiency right through commercial buildings, designed green buildings, transport, industry, the lot. There are so many opportunities. Just as a little example, one of the things I almost got through before I left Parliament and didn't for various technical reasons like opposition from officials and lack of time on the legislation schedule was energy efficiency standards for cars coming into the country, not the ones that are here, but the ones we buy from now on. We are just about the only OECD country that doesn't have fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. And I calculated that even if we never met the European standards, even if we always stayed worse than them, we could double the efficiency of the New Zealand fleet in just over 10 years. That's a huge amount of fuel saved. That's a huge amount of carbon saved just by setting a standard for what comes into the country. But there is a political decision that New Zealanders are not going to be told what vehicles they can buy, so that's off the agenda. The new timber products are quite exciting. We export an awful lot of our trees as whole logs, raw logs, without even the bark taken off them. And there is a technology actually developed at Canterbury University. We've got some really good, innovative people in this country, and we're not using them. A technology to strengthen wood to make it equally strong with steel or concrete for multi-storey buildings. Usually if you go above 2 storeys, you build in steel and concrete. But laminated timber with either post-tensioning or pre-stressing, if you want to get technical, is able to fulfil the same role as steel and concrete. Much lower carbon to make. Steel and concrete are both very high carbon materials and a lot of imported content. And of course, all the carbon in the wood is stored in the building and kept out of the atmosphere for as long as that building lasts. It's a brilliant technology for a low carbon future. We could have rebuilt the commercial centre of Christchurch in LVL, as it's called. We could have made it an international showcase. We could have made it the basis for a new export industry. We could have brought people here to see it, the sustainable city that New Zealand has built. But we mostly built, there are 5 such buildings built, we mostly built in steel and concrete because that's what people know. And there are some other reasons too, but they're being overcome. Investing $1 million in public transport creates a lot more jobs than investing it in new roads. Sorry, public transport and rail infrastructure creates a lot more jobs than investing it in new roads, and that is what New Zealand needs. There are a lot of people needing housing who can't afford market rates. We need more publicly owned housing for them to live in, and building those would employ a lot of people. So there's no shortage of jobs that are worthwhile and that should be done. They may not all be jobs that miners would do, but that's not what this particular challenge is about. It's about the economy as a whole. There are, of course, a lot of jobs in conservation and Burl did a report for Southland. How could they develop economically without the lignite projects? And one of the things they came up with was, and I keep meaning to look up that number, it's in our report, an extraordinarily large number of full-time equivalent jobs in new horticulture and the processing of those horticultural products. I remember being appalled years ago that New Zealand imports nearly all its own pet food in cans from Asia when we have a big meat industry in New Zealand. That to me seemed totally daft. That's what free trade does. And it's the same with a lot of fruits and vegetables that could happen here. So what could government do to encourage a low carbon economy and enable it to get off the ground? This doesn't have to be government driven or even government led, but there are some preconditions without which it won't happen even if industry wants to do it. The first one is a decent price on carbon. And there are a few rules around that. I mean, the ETS has been a complete and utter disaster, and the sooner we get rid of it, the better. It would even be better to get rid of it and put nothing in its place than to carry on with what we've got. But we shouldn't put nothing in its place. The price needs to be substantial. It needs to be reliable, and it needs to be constantly and steadily rising if it's going to stimulate new industry. Now, the public is not going to allow that unless you tell them what's going to happen to the money. And that was what was wrong with Labour's carbon tax, announced in 2002, going to come into effect in 2007, and they never said where the money was going. So, of course, people were hugely mistrustful and they lobbied against it. But if you say none of that money is going into the government's budget, it's all going back to the people on an equal basis, either as a citizen's dividend, which is what James Hansen recommends, or in various other ways, such as a tax-free threshold so that everybody gets the same tax rebate regardless of what they earn. Then people will accept it. And then when it goes up, people will say, oh, it's putting up the price of petrol, but hey, I got more money in my pocket because of it. And maybe I won't use so much petrol and then I'll have more money for other things. So pricing carbon is really important. Procurement. Government spends a lot of the national budget. And when it's deciding who to let a contract to, it takes a very short-term and narrow perspective, like ordering locomotives from China and closing the hillside workshops, because the initial price was cheaper. What happens when they get here? The contract says no asbestos, but they've got asbestos. So they've got to be taken aside, and that's all got to be taken out. A lot of other things where they weren't fit for purpose and they didn't operate properly. Eventually they get fixed up and they can get on the tracks. But hey, what was really cheaper? Doing that or building them here? So what we're arguing for here is a procurement policy where the big picture, the full life cycle costs and the long term are all taken into account in the cost-benefit analysis. We are towards the bottom of the OECD in spending on research and development. We need more spending on R&D if we're going to move into a new kind of economy. But we also need to skew it towards sustainability and low carbon, not R&D into anything, but R&D into what we need for the new economy. I've talked about shifting transport priorities already. And the wood industry has what it calls a wood-first strategy. And they're saying whenever government is putting up a building, they should require that wood is considered along with the other alternatives before a decision is made. Not allowed to leap straight into steel or concrete without considering what you could do with wood. So it's not predetermining the outcome, it's just saying there's got to be a level playing field and you've got to consider the options. They calculate that the decisions that would result from that sort of consideration would create 2,000 new jobs in manufacturing, a 400 million improvement in the current account deficit, which is a mix of new exports and reduced imports of steel and concrete. And that just happens to be more than we earned from coal exports in 2012 and a great deal more than we earn from them at the moment. So there are ways of filling that gap if we stop exporting coal. What about the miners themselves? We might create a lot of new jobs insulating houses, but people who've been driving big diggers aren't going to want to crawl under houses with insulation. They're not going to want to be baristas or waitresses or whatever. So there needs to be a proper study of the skills that the redundant people and the potentially redundant people have and where they are transferable to. We didn't see it as our job to do that, but we have had a look at the wide range of skills that people working in the mining industry have, and we note that many of them are transferable. For example, to quarrying, to earthworks for buildings, that a lot of them have electrical and plumbing skills which are needed whenever you build anything. A team of 20 people from the closed Spring Creek mine at Greymouth came across as a gang of 20 who'd worked together in the mines for a long time to work on the Christchurch rebuild. And they were reported in the Christchurch press as being really happy to have kept their social connections and come across, it's not all that far across the Alps, and contributing to the Christchurch rebuild. There are opportunities like that. The new timber products I've been talking about will create industrial type jobs which will appeal more to people who've been working in mining than some of the other things I've mentioned. Wood and wood waste recovery and transport is going to need drivers of heavy transport and operators of machinery and so forth. And of course, building more renewable energy. Our economy is likely to move more towards electricity as an energy source, even for transport. So building those geothermal and wind plants is going to require engineering skills. So the skills are transferable. The difficult question is not so much what you do about the miners themselves as what you do about the communities that they've been supporting. Yeah, I guess I can deal with this here. People say, well, this all sounds fine. Why can't we do both? Why can't we create this new low-carbon economy and all these new industries and still mine coal and sell it and be doubly rich? Wouldn't that be a good idea? Well, the answer is actually no, you can't. There's only so much capital, and it will go into one or it will go into the other. And even more important than that is the mindset that goes with it. Because if your mindset is totally fixated on fossil fuels, you're not going to have the ideas, the imagination, or the interest in building a low-carbon economy, and vice versa. So only when we price carbon and commit to keeping in the coal in the ground will those alternatives emerge. Moving to the communities, which are really feeling the pinch on the West Coast now. And I mean, this hadn't happened when we started writing this report. We started this report when coal was booming, and all this has happened during the period we've been putting it together. But, you know, the small engineering workshops, the hardware stores, the accommodation places where miners and others stay, the cafes on the West Coast are all feeling the pinch with mining jobs going. And it doesn't have to be a mining type job that supports them. It can be many other kinds of jobs in communities that can keep them going. For example, you could start by looking at where money leaks out of that local community, and can those holes be plugged? Is it the energy costs where the money leaves the community? Could a good energy retrofit program keep that money circulating locally? Is it food? I've heard that the supermarkets on the coast source nearly all their fresh produce from across the Southern Alps. There are opportunities to grow that locally. Greenhouses heated perhaps with some of the wood waste I've been talking about. Is it the banking system? What is it that people spend their money on and it immediately leaves? Well, of course, coal mining would be the worst, because any money that Bathurst makes at the Denniston mine, if it ever gets it going, is going straight overseas. They're 96% overseas owned. So that's where all the profits will go, if in fact there are any profits, which I think is increasingly doubtful. So we need a process for working this out. And it can't be imposed by central government, and it can't be imposed by business or the council. It's only going to work if we have an inclusive process where all stakeholders are around the table together. And that is hard, but I believe it's worth all the effort you put into that process, because the outcomes will be better. So it must include business and unions and iwi and councils and NGOs and polytechs, because the training is really important, and central government. And if you don't include everybody, then some people are going to be aggrieved later. And the reason it'll be hard is that some of those groups are at loggerheads now, the pro and anti-mining groups, for example. So it's going to take quite a lot of skills and facilitation to bring those groups together and say, we all want what's best for our community, how can we do it together? And central government must not lead the process, but it has a very important role to play. CANA believes that the leadership must be local, but that there must be central government resourcing. And we would like to see a unit set up in MB, the ministry in Wellington, dedicated to assisting the transition of communities beyond fossil fuels, with research, with money for retraining, with social protection for people who lose their jobs while they're in transition, and eventually with investment into some of the new opportunities that will employ people. Now, we looked overseas for what existed that had been done. We found some very negative examples, what not to do. What Maggie Thatcher did to the miners in the UK is what not to do. But she did that deliberately. That was a punitive measure. She wanted to punish the miners for going on strike, and so there was deliberately no provision made for the future of those communities, and some of them are still struggling. Some of them have found a good way forward. There's some Welsh communities that are doing well. They've done cycleways over the old mine sites and stuff, but others are still really struggling. I want to talk about a little area in the northeast corner of France called Nord-Pas-de-Calais. I don't know if any of you came across Skip Leitner when he was here speaking on energy. Anybody come across him? Yep. He works with Jeremy Rifkin. If you don't know Rifkin, you should have a look at his work on the third industrial revolution. It's really exciting stuff. Buildings become energy generators, green buildings, local grids connected to electric vehicles, a bit of hydrogen, all of that. Anyway, they were called in by a very far-sighted mayor. In this case, the local leadership came from the mayor, which is a really good place for it to come from. It's not the only possibility, but it's a very good place. He just happened to be a Green Party mayor, but we won't hold that against him. And he invited in Rifkin and his team to design a new future. Now, a little town there called you got it in your head? Oh, sorry. It's a very strange word. Also on Goel. Anyway, never mind. It's up in that region and it's in the report. Stopped coal mining in 1986, as far as I can gather, because the coal ran out. And they have got the biggest tailings mountains of coal tailings anywhere in Europe. You can probably see them from space. They're absolutely huge. And they were left with nothing. So they've been reinventing themselves as a centre for renewable energy. And with Rifkin's and Leitner's help, they have developed a lot of green buildings. They have built a lot of local renewable energy and renewable grids. They are a training centre for technical people in renewable energy and recognised in Europe for that. And they are thriving. They have the equivalent of a polytech there, training people in the new technologies. Not just in energy generation, but in the whole of building technology. Buildings, instead of being energy users, become energy generators. The other thing they did, which I thought was quirky but rather fun, is the Louvre Museum in Paris has always had difficulty finding enough space for all its exhibits. It wants to display them, and it doesn't have enough space in Paris. And they need careful temperature control. And underground is a very good place for temperature control. And somehow or other, they have got the Louvre to send a lot of their artworks to this little centre in the northeast of France. And they've created an outpost of the Louvre Museum. And people come to see that in considerable numbers. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are drop-in solutions and that Te Papa should move to Westport. What it says to me is that the ideas are there for communities to invent their own, and that there are ways forward, and that if people get around the table together. I think it took about 3 years to get the inclusive process working. And if you don't spend that time on the process, you won't get the outcomes, which is very hard for some of us who like to just jump straight to the solution. Anyway, that's Nord-Pas-de-Calais. You can Google it, you can have a look at it. You'll mostly find that it's all about war graves from the First World War, but if you can get past that, you'll find the story about the mayor and their renewable energy. Now, Rosemary is going to finish off by telling you about the Orkney Islands and then conclude, and we'll have some questions. I think that's all we need to do, isn't it? Yes. I'll turn this off again.
So one of our Coal Action Network people, Rachel Eyre, is from the Orkney Islands. Has anyone been to the Orkney Islands? I thought you might have. I thought you would be people. Yeah. Rachel remembers as a child when the families still had their own little peat areas where they dug up peat, and every summer the little children would have picnics out there, and the families would get together and help each other and dig up the peat to burn. The peat is now gone. Someone has told me there's still some left, but it's no longer happening. That way of life has disappeared for the Orkney Islanders. In the 1970s, the North Sea oil arrived. There were changes. There were a lot of positives and negatives for Orkney at that time, and Rachel's talked about that. But that is almost another era coming to an end. But for the past 3 decades, the Orkney Islanders, with funding from the European community, have been building wave and tidal energy research and technology. Stromness High School, where Rachel would have gone if she'd stayed, is now the European Marine Energy Centre. It's a world leader in this technology. The Orkney Islands have the largest single-rotor tidal turbine. They're self-sufficient in renewable electricity. Our Christchurch company, Windflow Technology, actually has 3 turbines up in the Orkneys. It suits the high wind speed that we do have here at times, and they also have. So that's quite nice knowing about that connection. Rachel now lives in Christchurch. So these are all very self-explanatory, and Jeanette has really talked about all of them in quite a lot of depth. We need to increase the royalties to fund that transition. The industry should be helping to fund this transition. We need to set up the government unit. The government must be involved. For goodness sake, there's a whole government department, there's a whole taxpayer-funded lobby group, Stratera, set up for the mining industry. We need something like that. We also need regional offices set up. We need it to be accessible. But we also have to be sure that it's the communities themselves who run this. We need the biggest polluters to stop making a profit from the ETS, which is what is happening now. So we need that price on carbon, and we need it to reflect, well, that's the next second to last one, we need to reflect the true cost of these fossil fuel industries. Increasing research and development, as Jeanette has said. Yeah, the first wood idea sort of is a demonstration of what the government could be doing. Putting not just the bottom line on a contract, but look at the jobs and look at the benefits for the communities. I mean, I'm preaching to the converted here. I know that. I know this. And we must stop new coal mines. No new coal. The full report is here. How many pages is it? 52? 50-ish? Took us a while. We're very pleased with the result. We don't think we've got the answers. We don't think we've got all the answers, but we've got to start this discussion, and we think that we've made a start, and we're really pleased that we've got union support, and Jeanette's had quite a lot of union support throughout the country for this. They're looking as well, and we think that's really important. So I've also got sign-up sheets if anybody doesn't belong to Coal Action Network and they don't get the regular newsletters that we put out. Please put your name down. Also, we're a voluntary... just please ignore my cat's footprints on the sign-up sheet. Voluntary organisation, we do this in our spare time. I'm not sure, actually, if we're allowed to ask for koha. Okay, very good. So I just want to say that we need to draw a line in the sand. We need to figure out how to get there. The sooner towns and communities take charge of their own futures so that they're not at the mercy of the vagaries of the market, the better. Thank you.